Well, I'll, okay. Um, so, as was mentioned a moment ago, I do work that looks at the really the history of race, land, and power in the United States. In particular, focusing on how we can understand the history of inequality and the struggle for racial justice through the lens of African American property owners and the lands that they held, struggled to hold on to, as well as those that they fought for access to. I've written books, as mentioned, about the history of black land ownership and land loss in the coastal South, as well as, and here if I can share my screen with you. Uh, on here. Oh, sorry about this. My computer does not want to cooperate with me. Here, I'll just do it like this. Um, okay, so you can see here, these are these are my two first books. One on that is on the history of African American land ownership and land loss in the coastal South. And this book, "The Land Was Ours," focuses on it tells the history of how African Americans acquired and developed substantial amounts of real estate in the coastal South during the period of segregation, and how they turned those properties into resorts, commercial enterprises, community spaces, social centers, areas that helped build community and facilitate commerce within a segregated Black America. And then I tell the story of how many of those areas were lost to white developers who pushed African Americans off the land, often took the land through legal or extra legal means. How places that were once owned by African Americans today are some of the most valuable real estate in the coastal South, worth millions of dollars. And those African American communities and families who own that land often saw nothing from that. They lost everything. And I tell the story in particular about the legal mechanisms that were used by real estate speculators and developers, often working in coordination with local officials to carry out this process of dispossession. And the lasting legacy of those losses on communities, as well as the role that it played in fueling white wealth accumulation, as well as the racial wealth gap between white and Black Americans. And in part, what I aimed to do in this book was to shift the conversation on how we talk about the racial wealth gap in America. This is a subject that has attracted a lot of attention in recent years for good reasons, because by the wealth gap between white and Black Americans is the widest of any measure of inequality. And when we mean wealth, we're not just talking about income. You can sort of even if we reach parity in terms of income between white and Black Americans, the wealth gap will remain, because the wealth gap and wealth is multi-generational. It's something that's passed down from parents to children. It's something that can build over time, and it's something that can be accumulated often through property ownership. Home ownership is one of the chief vehicles of wealth building for most American families today. And we know the story, and I guess increasingly the American public is becoming aware of the story of how African Americans were systematically locked out of opportunities for home ownership in the early to mid 20th century, at the very same time when many white Americans were vaulting into the middle class and would remain there for many generations thanks to opportunities to become homeowners in burgeoning suburbs. And that is certainly an important story, an important history that we need to understand, how federal government policies and real estate industry practices, denied the opportunities for home ownership to African Americans, kept them locked into ghettoized urban neighborhoods where they were preyed upon by slumlords who took their earnings, and so instead of allowing for home ownership to become a vehicle of wealth accumulation, it became instead a driver of poverty and inequality. And that's an important story. But one of the things that my book is also aiming to tell is how it wasn't just the denial of opportunity that explained and continues to explain the persistence of wealth inequality in America today. It was also the theft of the wealth that Black Americans did possess. And this is a case here where I'm writing about land that African Americans owned, land that they developed, land that they that could have become a vehicle for Black wealth building in the post Jim Crow era, but instead became another source of white wealth building. And in particular, I call attention to the legal devices that were used to carry that process out. And so that's what I want to talk about today, is actually kind of one of those particular mechanisms of dispossession, namely property taxes. And so I'm going to talk, and I guess again, this is maybe not as as sexy as a topic as talking about beaches, which has been the subject of my first two books. And I encourage you, again, if you're interested in understanding the history of beaches and America, I encourage you to check out my work on that subject. But what I want to talk about this afternoon is the way in which local taxation. I'm not talking about the IRS here. I'm talking about local taxes. Have quietly been a really important instrument of racism and of white advantage in both housing markets, in schools, and in local communities as a whole. And so I guess maybe one way to sort of start this discussion is to kind of make sure that we all kind of understand what a local tax is and how local taxes are levied, and then how they are distributed. So does anybody want to sort of take a guess as to sort of what what are the main sources of where do sort of localities get their revenue from? And I mean like cities like Milwaukee, like the city I live in, Charlottesville, Virginia, or the towns that you're from. Does anybody know kind of what where they get their revenue, and then what it mainly goes toward? Does anybody? You can just post it in the chat here, I guess, if you want to take a guess. Property taxes, yes. So the property tax is one of the main sources of local revenue, in that it is something that is assessed on properties. So within a jurisdiction, so within your town, your local government will send you a property tax bill. Based on, that is a percentage of the value of that property, or is based on the value of that property, the bill that you receive. Now, can anybody say kind of where that then, once they collect those property taxes, as well as other sort of local sources, where does it go? Education, great. That's one of the, again, these two issues are joined at the hip, and I think, and we'll get to that in a moment as to why that's significant. That property taxes are the lifeblood of local governments, and then in turn, public education in America is heavily dependent upon property taxes, as are other things like, again, public parks and amenities, infrastructure. I think, again, here talking about, say, water and sewer lines within communities, street lights, police and fire, all that kind of comes, not exclusively, but heavily comes from property taxes. So again, this is what distinguishes a local tax, in that it comes from a local source and then it is distributed locally. And so, again, this is, and then along with this, it's important to also think about, then who is in charge of administering this process? Who is, who are ultimately those who are deciding how these taxes are raised, how the proper tax burden for any individual within a community is determined, and then how are they distributed. And here, what I want to have us think about here, and thinking about, how local officials have local, not just sort of mayors, but or council members, but even these kind of low-level local officials, oftentimes kind of anonymous to most of the public, like say tax assessors, can play an outsized role in administering relations of power, and giving certain groups advantages and other groups disadvantages. Um, and and this is important in the sense, and given kind of what I'm going to talk about today, in that when we think about, say, the history of racism in America, when we think about the history of Jim Crow, when we think about the way in which African Americans struggled against forms of racial oppression during the era of segregation, we often are talking about, or our frames of reference are often center around local officials, but they're often say, or local figures of authority. So they could, but they're often say sheriffs, or even say, a governor standing in the schoolhouse door, like George Wallace here in Alabama, or again, people like Bull Connor in Birmingham, the public safety commissioner. We often think about these kind of visible agents of oppression, those who are literally on the front lines in trying to enforce white supremacy, and doing so violently, and doing so in overt ways, proclaiming their intentions to preserve white supremacy. And that's and again, much of the sort of battles that unfolded during the civil rights era were fought locally. They were fought in local communities, and they were fought against these local agents of oppression, like sheriffs, like mayors, like law enforcement within communities. But there was also other agents of oppression, many of whom operated in the shadows, like tax assessors. I mean, these are the folks in the basements of City Hall, lording over maps and big tax books. And in many ways, their actions were almost invisible to much of the public. And, and again, when we talk about and think about the civil rights movement, we think about the issues that were shaping the movement. We think about schools and voting rights, public spaces like, access to parks and swimming pools and public accommodations. But we don't often think about taxes. We don't think, or at least we don't think about sort of local taxes. And yet, as you just mentioned, in the chat, many of these things, like public parks, like schools, like infrastructure, the very issues in which African Americans and civil rights activists were fighting for equal access to, all were tied back to issues of taxation. And so, what I guess one of the things that this project is aiming to do is to get us to start thinking about how local taxes are administered, the powers that local tax assessors have wielded, and how they've used those powers in ways that have been historically detrimental to African Americans. So I guess what I'll sort of, what I'll do here over the next, several minutes is kind of provide a history of local taxation, in particular how property taxes have quietly worked in a discriminatory manner against African American taxpayers. And one place to begin, and I guess this is also sort of a place where my research on this subject began, was going back to the early days of African American freedom, to the period following the Civil War, when African Americans began accumulating property, when they became tax-paying citizens. And this was, again, part of the sort of history that we often aren't aware of, but I think is an important sort of chapter in the long struggle for freedom, was that African Americans struggled valiantly to acquire property after emancipation. That was the kind of guiding spirit of much of the struggle. It almost, land was was almost synonymous with freedom itself for formerly enslaved men and women. That land provided you the means to become free. And in spite of getting no help from the federal government, in spite of the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule, and in spite of numerous obstacles that white Southerners put in their way, African Americans accumulated a very substantial amount of land in the decades following the Civil War, such that by 1910, African Americans had, by one estimate, upwards of 15 million acres of land in the U.S., all of which they had accumulated in the 50 years following emancipation. But throughout that time period, their ownership of property was being undermined by the work of local tax assessors who would over-assess the value of black-owned land relative to white-owned land. And also, at the same time, as they were overtaxing black property owners, they were, of course, underserving them. I mean, this, again, is something we're probably, again, if you've studied the history of Jim Crow, or if you're familiar with that history of segregation, is that, one of its chief characteristics was not just that whites and blacks went to separate schools, whites and blacks used different drinking fountains and all of these other manner of sort of racial markers. It's that the ones that were available to African Americans were vastly inferior. That white controlled Southern governments spent a pittance on blacks' education as compared to whites. Again, dollars that were derived from taxes that were paid by African Americans as well as whites, but were being funneled toward white communities at the expense of African Americans. And this was, again, part of the whole sort of way that Jim Crow worked. It wasn't just separation; it was about subordination. It was about ensuring that not only were whites and blacks kept separate in public life, but that those resources, those public services that whites begrudgingly made available to African Americans was of a vastly inferior quality. And also along with this was this kind of, and this is kind of getting at the what you see on the screen right now, is this kind of, and actually, do you see, what screen do you see? Right? Do you see the slides right now? I can't. Okay, cool. One of the things that was actually that I found that made my research as a historian on this subject easier to identify, to actually to see just how much white assessors were overtaxing African Americans, was the fact that several southern states during this time actually kept separate tax books for whites and African Americans. They quite literally segregated their tax books. In that they would have a listing of all the property owned by whites in a county and what its value was for the purposes of taxes. And then they would have a listing of all the property owned by African Americans and what it was being assessed at for the purposes of taxes. So you see here again, these are images here of what the quote unquote colored land tax book in Virginia. And what that has allowed me to do is to actually go in there and add up the amount of acres that African Americans held in a county, and then the total assessed value of those acres, and compare them to the amount of acres that whites held and the total assessed value of those acres. And then, dividing it, seeing, okay, well, what was the average assessed value of a piece of property that was in the hands of a white person versus the average assessed value of a piece of property that was in the hands of a black person. Now, again, it's important to sort of note here that assessments are not the same as actual value. The assessed value of a piece of property is only the value that is being placed on it for the purposes of taxation. So you could have something that is, assessed at one thing, and you say, so let's say, you get a tax bill for your home, and they say your home is worth, let's say, $100,000. Okay, so that's how much the tax assessor says it's worth when it comes to determining how much your tax bill is. That has nothing to do with how much you can actually get for your home when you put it up for sale. You could, again, your house could be assessed at $100,000. You put it up for sale, and you can't get anyone to buy it for more than $50,000. Or conversely, you sell it for $200,000. In which case, again, you are if it's assessed at 100,000 and you sell it for 200,000, you're getting you're paying less taxes than you should. But here again, it's where so when you say, well, African Americans had this amount of assessed property at assessed value, that just tells you how much they were being taxed for, not how much it was worth. And so what I did was first I added up, and you can see here. First I compared these average assessed values, but then I actually went and found a source that actually indicated what the real value of these farmland, in this case in Virginia, was, and that came from the 1900 U.S. Census. So here, if you can see on the screen here, according to the 1900 U.S. Census, the average value of white-owned acreage for farmland in Virginia in 1900 was $13.15 for an acre of land. Again, that's just if you add up all the farmland that whites held and divided by the total number of acres divided, that's how much it comes out to. If you add up the African American acres and its value, again, what they could expect to receive, on the open market, the average value of an African American owned acre in real value was $6.49. So, in fact, African American owned land was worth, on average, half as much as white owned land. But then look here at the numbers below. These were the assessed values. This is what local tax assessors were valuing African American owned land versus white owned land. In every one of these cases, you are seeing here, and again, these are just a few that I pulled out from a spreadsheet that I'm in the process actually of putting together right now. You can see in every one of these instances, African American acres are being assessed for the purposes of taxation higher, sometimes significantly higher. So again, they are being grossly overtaxed. What this means is that African American taxpayers in the Jim Crow South are being forced to pay more than they should. And again, this is all keeping in mind that those tax dollars that they're contributing to local governments are being used then to pay for schools that their children can't go to, roads that aren't paved in their neighborhoods, water lines and sewer lines that don't run into their neighborhoods. I mean, all the sort of things that local governments are not providing African Americans, and they're being taxed more for that. So again, this is just to underscore the injustice here, just to kind of get a sense here of just how unjust these practices were. I'm curious though, if there's anything else that stands out to you just looking over this, looking over these numbers. Is there anything else that stands out to you about these? I'm curious. Go ahead and just enter something into the chat if there's anything that you find notable about these. What do you notice about? It's rural land, yes. It's yeah. I mean, what I was focusing on here, just because you can actually, again, an acre is an acre. It's the same sort of unit of measurement. It was just simply looking at farmland that was assessed by acre. So as opposed to say houses in cities, which is kind of presents a different set of questions. But is there anything looking at the numbers here that stands out to you? The assessed value for white acres is much lower than the 13. Yes, and that's a great point. And it's the same for African Americans. With a couple of exceptions here. For the most part, the assessed values are lower than the actual value. And that was, and this is significant because it's the key to understanding how this form of discrimination became invisible even to its victims. How tax assessors, local governments often were able to disguise these practices in a way that the beneficiaries often kind of didn't really realize what a good deal they were getting, or if they knew it was, they didn't acknowledge it. And the victims oftentimes didn't know how much they were being victimized. And this is because one of the other features of local taxation, which is still the case to this day, is that assessed values are invariably a fraction of their true value. Like this is known as fractional assessments. That most times when you get your tax assessment, if you get your tax assessment in the mail, that assessed value will be only a certain percentage of its actual value. And this is practiced by local governments across the country. Such that, again, if you are, but oftentimes it was unclear, what percentage it was. You just knew that it was lower than what its actual value was. Now, what that did is that it kind of it disguised, who was benefiting and who was losing, because on paper it seemed like everyone was getting a deal. Everyone was paying less. But in fact, and here again, this is, again, not to get too technical about tax matters here, but, in fact, it really doesn't matter what the actual dollar amount is. All that matters is what really truly matters is what the tax rate is, and then how your dollar amount compares to your neighbor's dollar amount. Because what ultimately determines what your tax bill is your property's assessed value times the tax rate. So, if your assessed value is only 50% of its actual value, but everyone's assessed value is 50%, then, you just raise the tax rate up a little bit and you get the same amount of revenue for the local government. They get the same amount regardless. So the tax rate is really the key here. But what these fractional assessments do is that they kind of disguise these inequities. They make it harder for the person who's being overtaxed to realize they're being overtaxed, and also, and especially harder to realize they're being overtaxed relative to their, white neighbor who might be paying much lower amounts. So again, this is how one of the ways in which these real, racist practices that had over time, long-term costs were not something that many victims often perceived. It wasn't flagrant. It was very subtle, but it built over time, and it had this kind of lasting damage. Now, this is also significant, and these findings here that I'm showing you are also significant in the sense that they completely go against everything that whites were saying about taxes at the time. One of the things that my research is really trying to do also is to completely explode the myth, a myth that we still see today in America, that African Americans are, don't pay that much in taxes and they benefit greatly from the things that tax dollars go to support. I mean, we see this kind of insidious rhetoric often in politics today, where you'll see kind of this assumption here that, poor people don't pay taxes, or racial minorities, they don't pay taxes, and therefore they should just be content with whatever us, the supposed, oftentimes, racially encoded white taxpayers contribute, that we're paying, taxes to support them. I mean, we see this kind of toxic rhetoric oftentimes in our politics today, and it's just a complete lie. And again, you can see it right here. You see it, and it's been that way for generations. And one of the things that I'm also looking at in my research is how that lie was circulated. And in fact, finding that this myth that African Americans didn't pay any taxes and therefore didn't deserve anything that local tax dollars went to support, like good schools, like good parks and playgrounds, like clean water. This kind of myth, as I'm finding, was actually really an important element of how the Jim Crow state was built. That all the kind of unequal allocations, whether it be for schools, whether it be for infrastructure, all that was kind of premised under this lie that African Americans as a community were not contributing their fair share. And so, again, looking back through, newspaper articles, looking back through the things that, white politicians would say, they would constantly say these things like, quote, colored people don't pay taxes anyhow, But again, when you actually go into the records and you actually look at, who was paying what, you see that in fact the opposite is true. And here's just again some numbers here, how that this notion that African Americans were somehow that their schools were being supported thanks to white taxpayers couldn't have been further from the truth. In fact, the truth is that African American communities were having to support white schools. It was the other way around. That in every state you would see that the number of tax dollars that African Americans were paying, and this is just direct tax dollars, direct payments. We're not even accounting for all the indirect taxes that African Americans were forced to pay. Like, say, if you are renting your home or renting land, you were certainly paying taxes indirectly through your landlord or through the landowner. We're just talking about direct taxes. In every state, you would see that African Americans were paying more than they were getting in return. So again, looking here through the lens of local taxes, actually looking at the numbers and actually taking advantage of the fact that these white segregationists quite literally left a paper trail for us as historians to do this research by the fact that they actually segregated their tax books. I mean, again, they weren't thinking about, their legacy or their reputation. They were just, again, but nevertheless, I mean, they kind of, left they left the paper trail for us to begin to uncover just what they were doing. You see here again how consistently this was happening. But this wasn't the only thing that was going on here, because the powers that local tax assessors had extended even beyond these kind of quiet instruments of discrimination, because they could also be used quite directly as a form of intimidation and retaliation against African Americans who dared to speak up and to challenge white supremacy. So here you see on your screen, these are pictures of two homes in the town of Edwards, Mississippi. The one on the left is a white-owned home. The one on the right is an African American-owned home. These two homes received the exact same tax assessment in the year 1967. They don't look like they're worth the same. No. The reason why the house on the right received a tax assessment at the same amount as the white-owned home on the left is because the owner of that home was participating in a boycott against white establishments in the town during the civil rights movement. This was perhaps one of the more flagrant instances in which white local officials used their power to tax to, in this instance, try to destroy a local civil rights movement. After the local African American community in Edwards, Mississippi, most of whom owned their homes. This was a home-owning black community. After they had waged a very successful boycott of downtown businesses in protest for a number of injustices, including the fact that whites didn't extend water and sewer lines to black neighborhoods. They didn't pave streets in black neighborhoods. They basically didn't give them anything in return for the taxes they were already paying. These were the issues that many local communities were fighting for. In retaliation for the African Americans leading this boycott, town officials literally went into the tax assessment books for the town and just doubled the taxes of every black person. Just went right through it and just just raised their taxes for no other reason than to just simply retaliate against the community. So again, this was, and here's another sort of important thing to keep in mind here, is that this happened in 1967. This is 3 years after the Civil Rights Act. This is 2 years after the Voting Rights Act. Why are they using taxes as a means of retaliation against civil rights protesters? Well, in part it's because they've kind of run out of some of their other instruments of oppression have been taken from them. But one area in which local white officials in Mississippi and Alabama, really in anywhere in the country, could still exercise power without fear of being sued in the federal courts or being taken to task by the Justice Department, was in the area of local taxation. There are specific laws on the books which exempt local tax assessors from being sued in federal court for discriminatory practices. That you as a property owner and property taxpayer cannot go into federal court and challenge your tax bill by claiming that it was unfairly assessed or done so in a discriminatory manner. The federal courts essentially are closed off to these types of lawsuits, and they remain so to this day. That in this case, the only option that the homeowners in Edwards had was in Mississippi State Court in 1967. And you can probably imagine they didn't get very far in state court in Mississippi in 1967. I mean, again, access to federal courts was key to advancing the civil rights movement, to be able to challenge these local white authorities who were flagrantly violating people's constitutional rights. You had to be able to get to the federal courts to be able to achieve justice. And that was unavailable to property owners and taxpayers in local communities, and it remains so to this day. I know I don't want to go over time. There's lots of stuff. I'm sure you might have some questions, but I did want to kind of end here on a note that is particularly relevant to America today, and perhaps as well for those of you who live in cities or live in suburbs, is to call attention to the ways that local taxation has profoundly shaped the kind of the spatiality and the racial demographics and inequalities we see in American cities and suburbs to this day. And in part, one way to think about this is to think about, and again, I'm not sure, where all of you live, but if you live in a city like, say, Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, or in the suburbs, you've probably noticed that if you're driving outside of the central city, you'll probably pass through any number of different municipalities. You can see here this map of Detroit on the right. All those different colors are different municipalities, like separate municipalities that have their own mayors, have their own form of governance. And this is no coincidence that these separate municipalities began sprouting up at the very same time, in the very same years when we were witnessing this exodus of middle-class whites from cities into suburbs. They weren't just establishing their own municipalities in the suburbs so that they could have their own community identity and their own name. They were also doing so that they could have their own tax base. One of the advantages of creating your own municipality was that then you could keep your property taxes to yourself. You could, that you didn't have to share them with the city you just left. That you can have your own tax base. That means you can say, if you are, say, a middle-class community with high property values, a lot of prosperity, not that many poor people, not that many people who might be a drag on your local tax base, then you can have great schools, you can have great public services, and you don't have to share them. You don't have to share that revenue with anyone else. And that, again, was by design. Many of these localities explicitly were created in order to be able to kind of hoard their own local tax sources. This, of course, had devastating effects on the cities that many homeowners, white homeowners left behind, who saw their tax bases shrink during these very same years, and really struggled to raise the kind of revenue that they needed to provide quality education for students in urban school districts, to be able to provide the kind of services that cities relied upon, because they were really losing their tax bases. And at the same time, this ability to for suburban residents to be able to keep their taxes to themselves really sort of fueled this kind of what I describe as an exclusionary politics in modern America, where one of the kind of abiding concerns of middle class, predominantly white suburbs was to ensure that their housing markets remained white, that home values continued to appreciate, and that so that they could continue to have that strong tax base that they could then use to support their schools, and also as well to keep out any threats to that tax base. So again, this was something that was being challenged in the courts in the 1960s and 70s unsuccessfully. There were lawsuits that, one, really important Supreme Court case that came before the Supreme Court in 1974 challenged the reliance of local schools on property taxes for their support, because the argument is that by kind of having the quality of one's education be tied to the property tax base of the neighborhood they lived in, that meant that poor kids are going to go to poor schools, and wealthy kids are going to go to wealthier schools, and those disparities are only going to sort of grow over time. That case was the Supreme Court rejected that argument and allowed for the reliance on property taxes to support public schools to stand. And this kind of, again, not just property taxes, but local property taxes that one community doesn't have to share with the other. This goes far in explaining the real vast disparities between per pupil spending in underprivileged school districts versus more advantaged ones. And it also, again, explains why residents in suburban communities are very keen to preserve those advantages. And to preserve property values, which are oftentimes sort of linked to, or at least seen as tied to, the presence or absence of people of color. So again, this has again manifold effects, and ones that again we are still very much kind of living with today. I wanted, if anything, just for this conversation to kind of get us thinking about the role of taxes in our lives, and how they kind of shape the world that we navigate on a daily basis. Oftentimes, again, in ways that are not that perceptible to us, but nevertheless still have a real impact on the things that do matter to us and that we think about a lot, like schools, like the public services, like quality of life, like housing markets. In many ways, we can't talk about any of these things without talking about the way that we have structured taxation in our society. So I've talked for a long time. I'm sure maybe you guys have some questions. I'd love to hear questions and engage in some more conversation over this. So I see a question here from Sandy. You asked, were the municipalities primarily white, or were there some led by African Americans? If so, did the ones run by African Americans experience an evening out of the tax gap and prosperity since they were no longer controlled by white officials? That's a great question. And in fact, this is, I think that gets to this issue of how housing markets are racialized in America, and how, again, property taxes are tied to the value of housing and real estate. And so one of the challenges that we're facing, say, cities like let's say Detroit, to take one example here, a city that saw whites leave in mass in the 1960s and 70s, and became a heavily majority black city. Black-run, African-American mayor, city council, but struggled and continued to struggle right up to the point where they were forced to declare bankruptcy, with being able to raise revenue through a tax base that had seen their property values plummet, and plummet in part because white racism and white assumptions about that an integrated neighborhood is bad for property values. This is one of the sort of you know the real estate industry, from banks down to your local realtor. They are still operating within a mindset that privileges whiteness, and privileges all white neighborhoods as being better in value. And in a sense, because of that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that when a neighborhood or an entire city becomes predominantly black, property values decrease, for no reason having to do with the African Americans living in those cities. It has everything to do with white racism, white aversion to living in integrated communities. But because of white racism, that has a direct effect on property values. Again, absent